Today on Cloud Security Lab a Week, it's time to learn about IAM roles. Roles are one of the most important fundamental primitives within Amazon Identity and Access Management. And they're probably a little bit different than how you've used the term roles before working on other systems, especially if you come out of the Microsoft world. So we're going to take a sec to review some of our IAM fundamentals and then show you where roles fits in and introduce a new fundamental called a persona. Now, in our first lab, we created our IAM user. And in that lab, we talked about entities, identities, and identifiers. The entity being the person or the device that has that we're going to give permissions to. The identity being the expression of that identity within a given namespace, just as I'm rmogul at securosis.com. Crud, now the entire internet knows my email address. And the identifier, which is the means by which an identity can be asserted. Now, if you've done all the labs so far, you are the entity and you have two identities. You have your email address you use to set up your root account, as well as the administrative IAM user, which is another identity, but only within the namespace of within your AWS account. Now, the problem with that administrative IAM user is that it's an IAM user. IAM users have a few big problems and are the root of on the about half of all AWS compromises. So the first problem with an IAM user is that it relies on static credentials, either a username and password, which is what we've been using, or an access key and a secret key, which is what you would use for API access. And attackers just love getting their hands on credentials. It makes it really easy for them to get in the front door. The other problem with an IAM user is that it has static permissions. So right now we have the administrative access policy attached, and you have full admin access all the time, even when you don't need administrative access. So we always love to get to least privilege, but the reality is when we're using something like an IAM user, the least privilege is what are the least privileges that entity might ever need, not the least privileges they need at that particular moment. And then the last problem is that an IAM user in AWS isn't just for human beings. It's the primary mechanism for getting API credentials for anything else that we want to allow access to our account, to the API calls to do things within our Amazon environment. So here's how kind of these three things work in practice. If you need basic privileges most of the time, but you need, say, administrative privileges only some of the time, like in an emergency, you either have to have one IAM user with full admin credentials, or you have to deal with two different IAM users with different sets of credentials. And then we start having a credential management problem, or you're overprivileged. These are the kinds of things that make things a little bit more difficult from us from a security standpoint to defend against attackers, especially because the entire management plane of AWS is on the internet. But what if there was a better way? And well, of course there's a better way. It isn't like this is Rogue One where we're going to kill everybody at the end, figuratively speaking. In AWS, the answer is an IAM role. And the easiest way to think about a role is that a set of permissions you can use for a time-limited session. And in our terminology for our IAM fundamentals, this is a persona. The definition of persona is the expression of an identity with attributes that indicate context, and that's a really wordy thing that I don't expect you to remember. But think about it this way. Sometimes when you go to do something in your account, you only need read access, so you're a reader. Other times, you need full admin access, so you're an admin. The persona is a representation of what you need to do at that point in time, and one identity can have multiple personas. Here, let me go ahead and draw it out. It'll make it a little bit easier to see. So if we switch over to the whiteboard, and we have a diagram I put together here where I have my entity, which is the person or device or code. That entity can have multiple identities. And one of those identities, let's say rmogul at y.net, whatever y.net is, I hope it's not something inappropriate, that can have different personas. So I can either come in as a regular user, or I could maybe have a persona as an administrator, or maybe have a persona as a reader. And one of the reasons that roles in AWS are a little bit different is you're probably used to not switching your persona during a session, but you can do that within AWS. Because a role in AWS is a little bit different. A role in AWS is a container for permissions that you can use at a given session. So what we have is we can define a role, and that role has two components to it. The first, like we've been talking about, is the permissions. What is that role allowed to do? The second is the trust policy, which is who or what is allowed to use that role. So in this case, let's just say I've set it up so that our mogul is allowed to assume that role. And that's the active process of changing your persona. We call it assuming a role. That's a term you're going to use a lot. And so when our mogul goes to assume a role, if that's allowed based on the permissions or based on the trust policy, then I gain that set of permissions for a temporary session, and I'm given temporary credentials. And this is the real key. The really important part about this is that IAM roles solve some of our problems. Roles are just awesome. Mature cloud organizations rely pretty much exclusively on IAM roles, and they get rid of almost all of their IAM users. In some cases, they get rid of absolutely all the IAM users, except maybe a few emergency ones in their management accounts. This eliminates a wide swath of potential attacks because now we reduce the risk of our lost and exposed credentials. So today's key points are IAM users, like we're using now to log into our accounts, are generally bad because they rely on static credentials and permissions. By the way, keep in mind, this is a problem more as you scale into larger, or not even larger, but any organization. If you just have your own personal lab account, that's totally fine. But as you get into some of these larger environments, that's where we start having more credential sprawl, and this becomes more of a problem. So IAM users, again, are bad because they rely on those static credentials and static permissions, and IAM roles are good because they use temporary credentials, and one identity can use different roles to access different sets of permissions based on what they need to do at a given point in time. IAM roles, it's how we change our personas, not our personalities. That's all on you, boo. And Amazon uses IAM roles for everything, including their own internal services. All right, let's jump in and create our first IAM role. First thing you want to do is log into your account. And the region technically doesn't matter at all for this because all of IAM runs out of US East, but we want to make sure you're set for Oregon. You just want to get in the habit that unless I tell you otherwise, we always want to be in the Oregon region. Now, let's go into IAM itself. So it's right here on my dashboard, but I'm going to type it in just in case it's not there on your dashboard. And we'll go to roles. Next, we'll go to create role. Now, this is the part I talked about with that trust policy. So AWS is calling it the trusted entity type for the role. And it can be a lot of different things. You can do federation. You can write one by yourself. We're going to make one for another AWS service. And in this case, the role that we are going to create is one we're going to use in a bunch of labs later. That's going to allow our instances, our virtual machines, to talk to a service known as the Systems Manager service. So we're going to go with AWS service, which is the default of what's checked here. Then we're going to pick the use case. This is basically what service are we picking. Now, you'll notice the two most common are EC2, which is virtual machines, and Lambda, which is serverless functions. These are just the execution environments where we use roles probably more than anywhere else, but pretty much every other AWS service is listed. We'll pick EC2. Now, for some of these, this isn't going to come up nice and clean on the wizard like it does for EC2, but we're going to take advantage of this. It's going to give us a little bit of a shortcut. So the one we want to pick is EC2 role for AWS Systems Manager. Now, all this is going to do is shortcut us and automatically attach the policy so we don't have to search for the policy. We're going to use an AWS managed policy, which is a set of permissions that Amazon maintains for that service. And we'll talk about policies in a lab here pretty soon. So we're going to go EC2 role for AWS Systems Manager, zoom back out here, and then click Next. The policy that's attached is called AWS SSM Managed Instance Core. And if I click on it, it'll show me the permissions that this policy has in either a summary or in the JSON. And we're not going to go through all of these permissions today. We'll come back and discuss that at a later time. But the important thing to know is that Amazon just defaulted us to the policy that we knew we wanted in this particular situation. And we can actually look at it and review it. And if you want to attach other kinds of policies, you can do that as well. You would just pick the generic EC2 option and then pick which policy you wanted to attach. Now, we're not going to worry about permission boundaries. That's a more advanced concept we'll cover at a later time. Click Next. We have to give our role a name, and we're going to call it SSM Instance. Try to use the same name that I'm using because that's going to keep us in sync as we get into later labs. And again, it's Systems Manager. That's where that SSM comes from in terms of the name, so that we always know if we attach this role, that those instances are going to be allowed to talk to Systems Manager. Now, the trusted entities, this is that trust policy that I was talking about earlier in the lecture portion. And if you look, and we haven't covered the Amazon policy language yet, that's actually in the very next lab. But the short version is that we are allowing the EC2 service to perform that assume role operation. So that means that EC2 is going to be allowed to use this role. Without this trust policy, even Amazon themselves could not use the role. Then we have the permission policy. Remember, a role is just a container for permissions with the trust policy of who or what is allowed to use the role and the permissions policy of what is that role allowed to do. That's all we need here. We don't need to attach any tags, and we'll go ahead and create the role. I know this is one of these terrible ones where I subject you to like 10 minutes of lecture. I don't even know. I don't have a timer. And then the lab itself takes about 2 minutes. Now, you'll notice that there's a couple of other roles here. These roles were ones that were created by AWS themselves as we built our account. And so these are some default roles that are built in within AWS that we actually could even go ahead and delete, but it would create problems for us to do that potentially. So the role that we just created, SSM Instance, and we can see here as we review the role itself, it has our Amazon resource name, but there's an interesting piece here that we're going to cover more later, but I do want to make you aware of, which is known as an instance profile. The instance profile is an extra little piece you need to allow instances to use a role. Now, when you're creating roles in the console like we did today, that's done automatically for you. But if you ever create them via the API or the command line interface, you actually have to create the instance profile separately from the role itself. And again, we will cover those more later as we get into using different kinds of roles within the EC2 service. So we have our role itself, and again, those two main pieces, the permission policy of what is it allowed to do, and it's a bunch of permissions related to that SSM service, and then the trust relationships, which is who is allowed to use it, which is EC2, and we haven't really said anything else here because this is a really basic one, and we're keeping things simple just for the start. That's it. Really easy to create a role, but again, the key points that you need to know about roles in AWS. So role is kind of like a persona. It's a different set of permissions that we can assume based on what we need to do at a given point in time. The role we created today was one that we're going to use later for our EC2 instances. Roles themselves are a container for permissions that you use for a session. And there's two policies associated with every role. The policy of who or what is allowed to use the role, and the permission policy, which is what is that role allowed to do. All right, that's it for this week. And in our next lab, if you're following these in order, we're actually going to go into more depth on those IAM policies.